crescendo of ululations greeting his arrival, the Iraqi Christian faithful overjoyed, bearing witness to a man they'd never dreamt they would see. Pope Francis, equally elated, waved back before entering through the doors of St. Joseph's Cathedral. Here on Saturday in the heart of Baghdad is where the pontiff would preside over the first ever mass held in Iraq by the head of the Roman Catholic Church. Flanked by priests, the Pope reminded Iraq's majority Chaldean Catholics of one of the core tenets of the faith.
Non si intristisce, ma rilancia. Non si scoraggia, ma resta creativo. Di fronte al male non si arrende, non si rassegna.
Once numbering over 1.5 million, Iraq's Christian population has dwindled to just 300,000 following the US invasion and violence brought about by Islamist militants. The Pope's visit is designed to encourage those who have remained to help the country rebuild, as well as spreading messages of peace. In a landmark meeting with one of Shiite Islam's top clerics, Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, the pontiff earlier made a powerful appeal for interreligious coexistence before delivering a similar message at the ruins of Ur, the birthplace of the Prophet Abraham, who is common to Muslims, Christians and Jews. Pope Francis heads north on Sunday to Mosul, where churches and other buildings still bear the scars of conflict brought on by the Islamic State group.
كبيرة جدا لدى المسيحيين داخل العراق وخارج العراق، وأن هذه الفرحة سوف تنعكس بعودتهم إلى العراق وعودتهم إلى مدنهم وإلى مناطقهم وخاصة مدينة الموصل.
The head of the Catholic Church will later hold a mass in a stadium in Erbil, where 8,000 people are expected to attend.
Is life fully back to normal for people in Israel?
It's not fully back to normal. There are still few restrictions, but the thought that the restaurants are open, it's such a symbol of normality. This is a very foodie culture. Like all big places that have restaurants, people really flock to them. I heard someone saying they were sick of their own cooking. I know I'm sick of my own cooking.
Yeah.
So the relief really is palpable. It's not open to everyone, of course. There's a carrot and stick thing going. If you are fully vaccinated, that's 2 doses plus 2 weeks, you get a certificate and you can go to the restaurant, and they have to police that. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, but they are saying they're willing to police that. If you are in schools, there's a stoplight system. If you live in a red area, your children can't go to school. But if it's green or yellow, they can. And I have to tell you that I read an article saying that on dating websites, the most attractive feature is to say status vaccinated.
That's the new elite status.
A battle of wills in the midst of tragedy, one that has killed more than 250,000 Brazilians in a year, the second highest death toll in the world. Local authorities shut down Brazil's capital city, Brasilia, to save the health system from total collapse. More than 90% of intensive care beds are occupied, and COVID-19 infections are on the rise. The emergency lockdown was met with anger by some, who took to the streets shouting, "We want to work." And President Jair Bolsonaro took their side. He threatened to punish governors and mayors who are pushing for lockdowns and curfews by cutting off federal assistance.
O auxílio emergencial vem por mais alguns meses.
From now on, the governor who closes his state, who destroys jobs, will be the one who pays for the emergency aid.
But he offered no solution to the health crisis, the worst since the beginning of the pandemic. 20 out of Brazil's 27 state capitals have run out of beds in their intensive care units. And an estimated 70 Brazilians are dying every hour from COVID-19. Meanwhile, vaccines are slow in coming, and only 3% of the population has been inoculated so far.
If we do not stop the outbreak, we'll face a total collapse of the health system. We can increase the number of intensive care beds all we want, but if the number of infections continues to grow, there'll never be enough. The only solution is a 14-day nationwide lockdown, like other countries have imposed with success. But here we face a lack of leadership and total denial.
Several Brazilian states and the capital Brasilia have imposed restrictions to fight this second wave of the pandemic.
But here in Rio de Janeiro, life continues pretty much as usual. People are making the most of their summer, staying on the beach, as you can see, until nightfall.
But fears of a second wave and the total lack of unity in fighting the pandemic are affecting business. Carlo Fiori says he rarely leaves the house, but has decided to enjoy one last night out. He's sure things will get much worse before they get better. Monica Yanaki of Al Jazeera, Rio de Janeiro.
And every day, day after day...
Professor Tulio de Oliveira leads the team at South Africa's University of KwaZulu-Natal. They're responsible for sequencing the genomes of hundreds of samples of COVID-19.
They move to this room where they will extract the RNA of the virus.
Simply put, scientists here observe not only how the virus grows and mutates, but also how effective vaccines are in protecting people from the disease. It's at this lab late last year that scientists discovered one of the first COVID-19 variants in the world, after doctors noticed a worrying rise in infections.
The 501Y V2 variant, and it had around like 20 to 30 mutations from the original strain, with 20 of them causing amino acids change, which change the function of the protein, which translating the virus to be more transmissible, but also less neutralized by antibodies.
So given that scientific understanding, it's not a surprise that the new variant is the dominant variant in South Africa, given the nature of it.
Exactly. So this variant, when it arrives, it is basically had before 20 or 30 different lineages circulating, and they all basically disappear. Now we have only the variant. We just finished the February data, and 99% of the genomes is this variant.
The discovery of the variant derailed South Africa's plans to begin immunizing its health workers with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Studies had suggested it would cut the risk of contracting the original variant of COVID-19 by 75%. But a local trial of about 2,000 people showed it was less effective against the new variant.
We showed together with colleagues of Oxford and AstraZeneca that a lot of infections happen both in the placebo arm and also in the vaccinate arm.
Scientists say more research is needed to show how effective that vaccine is against severe illness. But the World Health Organization has approved its emergency use. For now, South Africa is using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is shown to be more effective, and will instead distribute its batch of AstraZeneca vaccines to other African countries.
The AstraZeneca has been very effective against the non-variant.
As the virus is likely to continue to mutate, there are warnings that South Africa's vaccination drive should speed up. And it's labs like this one that help ensure scientists stay on top of those mutations and determine just which vaccines will work. FAHMIDA Miller, Al Jazeera, KwaZulu-Natal. Thandazile Msemang buried her brother behind her family home in Mtubatuba in KwaZulu-Natal just months ago. She says he died from COVID-19, while she says her family's been devastated by his and the death of 2 other relatives. They're not convinced the vaccine will protect them.
Some say that no, it's not a good vaccine to be taken because it can continue killing us. They can say that it will help us, but it can continue. Maybe we are going to die more after this vaccination.
Thandazile lives in the village of Sumkele, which is nearly 200 kilometers from the city of Durban. The main clinic here is already under pressure. Its limited resources have been further strained by the COVID-19 pandemic.
We have many challenges. We have few nurses and no doctors.
In its first phase of the vaccine rollout, South Africa's government has vaccinated tens of thousands of healthcare workers across the country. Here in KwaZulu-Natal, fewer than 2,000 have received the jab so far. Only after all healthcare workers are immunized will it vaccinate essential workers, the elderly and the vulnerable. More than a third of South Africans live in rural areas that are often difficult to get to and have poor infrastructure. While tens of thousands of health workers in urban areas have been vaccinated, it's unclear how the government plans to inoculate those who haven't been and others in areas like this one. In addition to its current supply of Johnson & Johnson vaccines, the government is expecting 20 million doses of the Pfizer jab later this year. But it requires storage at -70 degrees, and that's unlikely in rural areas where facilities are limited.
So our plans going down are clear, but for now we can't just rush that process because we will create an expectation that will not be fulfilled. If we say now, get ready, you'll be vaccinated, then they will say when. And then we are not ready with those specifics because we are still, as I've said to you, we've got only about 10,000 vaccines.
The government expects more vaccines every 2 weeks, and it's increasing the number of vaccination sites. But as Tandezile's family mourns their loss and fear becoming sick themselves, their faith in the vaccine and when it will come remains uncertain. FAHMIDA Miller, Al Jazeera, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa.
Skirmishes return to the streets of Dakar as Friday marks the third successive day of protests in Senegal's capital, following the arrest of the country's opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko. New restrictions by government on internet access, not enough to quell the dissent. On Thursday, chaos had erupted as clashes broke out between Senegalese police and university students. And by late evening, the violence reached a climax, leading to the first protester death since the dissent began. Sonko was arrested on Wednesday after hundreds of his supporters clashed with police, protesting a rape accusation made against him, which he denies. As the leader of the opposition Pastef party, and largely popular among the youth, Ousmane Sonko is seen as the strongest challenger to President Macky Sall ahead of the 2024 elections. Sonko's lawyers believe there is a conspiracy in play to have him silenced.
Son arrestation et sa conduite à la section de recherche avaient uniquement pour but de faire en sorte qu'on puisse le déférer. Donc maintenant, il est clair que l'état de droit a cédé la place à un état répressif.
Despite an increasing reputation as a stable democracy, Senegal hasn't seen violence flare up like this in years. Amnesty International also recently expressed concerns about what it claims to be a series of arbitrary arrests amidst a crackdown where 2 private television channels were suspended for 3 days following coverage of the demonstrations.
This mine in southern Silesia has been working for 120 years. Some can't imagine it could ever stop.
Mining must have a future because of the history of this land and all the people it employs. My father worked at the mine, my grandfather too, and so do I.
But things are changing. These young men are also from mining families, but the pits weren't for them. They're anti-smog campaigners.
When we installed them, these lungs were white. The fabric was snow white.
And after just 1 week of breathing, of air pumping through them, the lungs have already turned pretty black.
We see these soot particles all over town. They're what makes cars dirty and windows too. And I'm sure as we walk around now, we'll get some in our own lungs.
It's not electricity generation, but household heating, which accounts for nearly 1/5 of all coal burned in Poland, that poisons the air here.
This smell, we used to call it the smell of winter. But it's not the smell of winter, it's the smell of the filth coming out of those chimneys. As a society, we're only just beginning to understand that this is a shortcut to ill health. And we want to change it.
Concern over local air pollution is feeding a broader environmental awareness.
Some people, as they learn about smog and bad air quality, also start to find out about CO2 emissions and their impact on global warming.
Others, though, are still in denial about climate change. This winter was snowy, after all. In any case, for many people, the bottom line is the bottom line. Rafał Kolarczyk is a former miner.
Of course, it would be better to burn gas, but it comes with a price tag.
All the more so since he changed jobs.
I worked at the mine for 2 years, then they laid off 250 people. Today I work at the Fiat car factory, and I earn barely half what I made at the mine.
I put this to the deputy mayor of RUDA, another Silesian mining town.
This is really the heart of the problem. Miners would be happy to stop working in the mines if they could earn comparable wages in a different job. But today, that's hard to achieve.
Miners enjoy not only prestige in this historic region, but also wages at least a third higher than the national average. The unions long resisted change, but last year finally agreed to a plan to close the last state-owned colliery by 2049. This one is to cease operations in 2030.
My dad was a miner. He worked at that mine. He retired after 25 years, and now he's a happy retired miner. We've known for a while that at some point that critical moment would come when coal is phased out and we have to head in a different direction.
Post-Brexit teething problems spark yet another dispute between the UK and the EU. Brussels has accused London of betraying its trust after the British government went over its head and unilaterally extended a grace period on Irish sea border checks. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has denied violating the Brexit treaty.
We're taking some temporary and technical measures to ensure that there are no barriers in the Irish Sea, or to make sure that things flow freely from GB to NI, and that's what you'd expect.
Under the Brexit deal, Northern Ireland has remained part of the EU customs area, meaning goods arriving from the rest of the UK have to be checked. Some grace periods, where procedures aren't yet fully applied, were set to expire at the end of March, though the UK says they will be extended until October. In protest, the European Parliament has declined to set a date for its vote to validate the Brexit trade deal. Several MEPs, including the head of the Trade Committee, are even threatening to refuse to ratify the agreement. Though Northern Irish First Minister Eileen Foster said the UK had to act to protect its internal market.
The European Commission was simply not listening to what was going on in Northern Ireland. If the UK government hadn't taken action, that would have caused untold difficulties for our ports.
The ongoing tensions over Brexit could even jeopardise a peace deal which ended decades of violence. Loyalist paramilitary groups have said they are withdrawing their support for the Good Friday Agreement.
It's always been difficult for Roxana and her family to eke out a living, but the pandemic has made their lives harder still. For her, not working is not an option.
It's for my family. My mum and dad have been sick and the medicines are very expensive. All we can do is go out and keep working.
Voting in Bolivia is obligatory, but Roxana will go to the ballot box with little optimism.
Even though the elections bring new authorities, the politics are always the same. They campaign, they talk a lot, but when they're in power, they forget. I believe it will always be like that.
Bolivia is striving for stability after years of political turmoil, which saw former President Evo Morales flee the country in 2019 to be replaced by a right-wing interim government. Socialists are now back in charge nationally, but it's the authorities' handling of the pandemic that now underlines every campaign promise, every political decision.
All the candidates all over the country have said they'll fight against the disease, but there are still particular problems in each region in relation to infrastructure.
The pandemic has starkly highlighted the issues that most concern Bolivian voters.
The most important is health, not just physical, but mental health too. And with what we're going through right now with this virus, we also need to be economically stable.
Medical professionals are on strike over government emergency measures to fight the disease, while the number of daily new infections continue to rise. COVID-19 has killed more than 3,000 people in Bolivia. Luis Arce, a former minister in Evo Morales' government, won presidential elections last October, organised at the height of the pandemic. His first few months in office dominated by COVID-19. The vaccines are arriving, but not as many and not as often as people would like.
It is very difficult to buy vaccines in the world. Today it is very difficult to get them. All countries are trying to buy vaccines.
That's not what Roxana and millions of Bolivians like her want to hear. The degree of patience and understanding they have in their politicians' handling of the pandemic will be reflected in the ballot box. Daniel Schweiner, Al Jazeera, Buenos Aires.
Dispersing protesters with tear gas and gunfire on Thursday, police in Myanmar once again came down hard on opponents of last month's military coup. It comes after what was the bloodiest day since protests began, with 38 people killed by security forces on Wednesday, according to the UN. Amongst them, Kiel Sin, who's become a symbol of the protesters' fight for democracy. Hundreds of mourners attended the 19-year-old's funeral in Mandalay on Thursday. The dancer and taekwondo champion was shot in the head by security forces. This photo of the moments before her death has gone viral. Wednesday was a gruesome milestone which prompted the United Nations to toughen its stance.
But there are action steps that need to be taken. First of all, sanctions, focused, coordinated, tough sanctions. A global arms embargo will also be very important to stop the flow of arms into the hands of the generals. And I'd like to see the Security Council make a reference of this horror to the International Criminal Court.
Witness reports say security forces opened fire on crowds with rubber and live bullets in a number of cities with no warning. International condemnation has so far been ignored by Myanmar's military. Diplomats say the UN Security Council will discuss the crisis at a meeting on Friday. Sanctions are being considered by Western countries, including the United States.
Chinese President Xi Jinping was among the few who entered Beijing's Great Hall of the People not wearing a mask. The leader presided over the opening of China's National People's Congress, keen to present an image of strength and victory. Victory over the COVID-19 outbreak and the economic stagnation it caused.
China was the world's only major economy to achieve growth. We attained a complete victory in the fight against poverty, and we scored decisive achievements in securing a full victory in building a moderately prosperous society in all respects.
A GDP target of 6% was announced for this year. Beijing is aiming to boost domestic consumption and encourage more self-reliance amid worsening ties with the US.
This year's Congress is taking place in the face of rising international criticism over China's treatment of Muslim Uyghurs, the coronavirus outbreak, and reforms in Hong Kong. One of the laws being discussed over the next 7 days will dramatically overhaul the territory's political system and deal an added blow to democracy activists.
Beijing is looking to reduce the number of electoral seats given to representatives directly voted in by the public and increase those allocated to pro-Beijing industry and social groups. Beijing-backed Chief Executive Carrie Lam and her team will also be given new powers to vet legislators. Some say the law crushes the democratic rights promised to the territory during its handover from Britain to China.
The 1997 handover to China was the handover, but this is the takeover. This is the Beijing basically deciding they want no more opposition out of Hong Kong. This was prompted by those 2019 street protests where you had up to 2 million people at one point going through the streets. Those protests became increasingly violent and increasingly directed against mainland China.
Last month, dozens of organizers of a primary vote to choose Democrat candidates for legislative elections were arrested under a national security law unveiled at last year's Congress. Beijing says it's preserving Hong Kong's stability by ensuring those holding public office are loyal to the Chinese government. Analysts say Xi Jinping is sending a message to the international community and won't hesitate to flex China's military muscle.
When it comes to China's borders, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, we see his hardline tendencies. He looks to the future and wants to build his political and military achievements like an emperor.
Beijing considers Taiwan a rogue Chinese province and has warned it won't accept any move toward independence. But the island's leaders say they will continue to defend its democracy and freedom. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Beijing. Thousands of China's most powerful politicians are gathering in Beijing on Friday to chart the country's roadmap for the next 5 to 15 years. The annual National People's Congress, or NPC, was postponed last year following the coronavirus outbreak. This year, COVID-19 cases are under control, and analysts say President Xi Jinping will be touting an image of triumph, as well as consolidating his power.
He has been establishing his power through political and military achievements. In the future, he will focus on competing with other superpowers. He plans China's political future like an emperor.
Strengthening loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party is a priority. Beijing is preparing for the party's centenary in July.
During the Congress, China's leaders will release their annual work report outlining economic targets. Beijing is expected to encourage domestic consumption and continue to push for a more prosperous society. To do this, they will need to address the challenges of a widening wealth gap and an aging population. A GDP goal is also usually set, though this was skipped last year because of uncertainties around the pandemic. And some expect China's defense spending to be accelerated, especially given recent tensions with Taiwan and in the South China Sea.
China's strained relationship with the United States is another focal point. Beijing had hoped to reset ties with Washington, but US President Joe Biden is continuing the tough stance taken by his predecessor.
From their perspective, it's been disappointing. They see a lot of the same rhetoric, a lot of the same goals and ends, methods, means that were employed by the Trump administration.
Internationally, Beijing is facing increasing criticism over its treatment of Muslim Uyghurs, as well as political reforms in Hong Kong. It's expected to tighten its grip over the territory and pass laws to ensure only those loyal to Beijing are able to hold office. The national security law banning subversion was unveiled at last year's NPC. Dozens were arrested under the law this week for holding a primary vote ahead of elections. Meanwhile, environmental policymakers will be watching for further action on climate change. The government is expected to set targets for reducing carbon emissions, moving towards Xi's goal of making China carbon neutral by 2060. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
Making tracks on Mars. The Perseverance rover went for a spin 2 weeks after landing on the red planet.
This is just a huge milestone for the mission and the mobility team. Like, we've driven on Earth, but driving on Mars is really the ultimate goal. And just so many people I can't even count have worked towards this very moment for years.
It wasn't a long trip, just over 6 meters in total, nor was it a fast drive. The whole exercise took 30 minutes at almost 0.02 kilometers per hour. But so far, Perseverance is working perfectly.
We haven't had any hardware issues. No, everything has been working that we've been checking out. And so it's actually been amazingly smooth in that respect. I'm going to knock on wood here.
In this picture of a rock formation near the landing site, you can clearly see stratification, or layers of rock. They may be made of sediment washed down billions of years ago when Mars was rich with surface water.
These resistant layered rocks were likely deposited by rivers flowing into the ancient Lake Jezero.
Perseverance has been flexing its robotic arms with instruments named Sherlock and Watson, mechanical detectives searching for signs of ancient life. Within weeks, the rover will deploy its mini helicopter, Ingenuity, for a test flight. Scientists have named the landing area in honor of the late Octavia Butler, a novelist who was the first African-American woman to win top prizes in science fiction and a MacArthur Fellowship for her books, including Parable of the Sower. With the help of a spacecraft orbiting Mars, scientists are plotting possible routes for Perseverance to reach its goal, an ancient river delta that may hold signs of long-extinct microbial life forms. If found, such signs would be evidence that life, perhaps even intelligent life, exists in abundance beyond Earth, throughout the vastness of space. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Los Angeles.